Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a really fascinating contradiction that sits right at the core of how we view the world. So let's dive right in. We all rely on our common sense every single day, right? It helps us navigate the subway, chat with our boss, and just get through daily life without overthinking every little detail. But here is the central paradox we're going to explore. That brilliant, everyday common sense of ours, it is spectacularly terrible at explaining collective human behavior. When we try to use it to understand the economy, corporate mergers, or massive cultural trends, it completely falls apart. To show you just how flawed our intuition can be, let's do a quick test. Do you think you are an above-average driver? Statistically speaking, you probably said yes. Interestingly, this exposes a quirk known as the Lake Wobegon effect. Studies show that roughly 90% of Americans believe they are above-average drivers, which, mathematically speaking, is absolutely impossible. It's a playful reminder that we are all incredibly prone to biases. We often lack an accurate understanding of our own behavior, let alone the behavior of massive groups of people. And this brilliantly illustrates the premise of the source material we're exploring today, Duncan Watts' eye-opening book, Everything is Obvious: How Common Sense Fails Us. Watts is a sociologist, and he argues that the very way we make sense of the world actually prevents us from truly understanding it. In this explainer, we are going to dismantle our reliance on intuition. By looking at hard data, we'll reveal the hidden variables and invisible forces that are actually driving human action, and show you why common sense isn't quite as common as you might think. Let's jump into Section 1, the myth of common sense, when intuition fails. We tend to think of common sense as this universal truth, a completely rational worldview. But the reality? Common sense is actually just a set of hidden, socially embedded rules we barely even notice, well, until somebody breaks them. To ground this concept, take Stanley Milgram's famous subway experiment. Milgram, a renowned social psychologist, sent his students into the New York City subway with one very simple task: walk up to a physically able person and ask them for their seat. The rule against doing this is entirely unwritten, yet his students found the task virtually impossible to execute. They felt immense dread. When Milgram actually mocked them and tried to do it himself, he reported feeling physically nauseated just trying to ask the question. This shows us that the social order we take for granted is maintained by an incredibly complex web of invisible rules. And here's the kicker: those rules are entirely relative to where you live. Let's look at the ultimatum game. It's an experiment where one person is given money and proposes a split with a stranger, who can then accept or reject it. Westerners usually propose a 50-50 split, and we reject anything less as unfair. But when researchers took this game to different cultures, common sense completely flipped. The Machiguenga tribe in Peru happily accepted lowball offers of around 25%, because their culture just doesn't carry a sense of loyalty to strangers. Free money is free money. But on the flip side, the Ah and Gnau tribes in Papua New Guinea rejected massive, hyper-fair offers of over 50%. Why? Because in their culture, accepting a large gift creates an unwanted, lingering obligation. What is completely obvious to one culture is absolutely bizarre to another. Moving on to Section 2, the illusion of rationality, the tip of the iceberg. When we try to explain human behavior, we love to look for conscious, rational motivations. But those conscious choices are merely the visible tip of the iceberg. Hiding underneath is a tangled web of environmental triggers and framing biases. For example, why does Austria have an organ donor consent rate of 99.9%, while their neighbor Germany sits at a mere 12%? If you use everyday common sense to answer this, you might guess it has to do with deep cultural differences, maybe religious variations or different medical infrastructures. You'd assume a massive difference in behavior must have a massive rational explanation behind it. But here is the humbling punchline. It's all about the power of the default. The massive disparity between these two nations has absolutely nothing to do with morals, religion, or education. In Austria, the DMV form makes being an organ donor the default choice. You have to actively opt out. In Germany, the default is not to be a donor. You have to actively opt in. That's it. That tiny administrative detail, a simple checkbox, is enough to drive the rate from 12% to nearly 100%. Our supposed rational choices are so often just us blindly following the path of least resistance. And defaults are just the beginning. There is a totally bizarre array of psychological triggers secretly dictating our supposedly rational behavior. When an Israeli daycare started fining parents for picking up their kids late pickups actually increased. Why? Because the fine removed the parents' guilt. They felt they were just buying extra time. In liquor stores, playing German music in the background secretly causes people to buy more German wine. Online shoppers are literally more likely to buy expensive, softer couches if the website's background is made of fluffy clouds. And incredibly, in auctions, having people write down the last 2 digits of their social security number before bidding actually anchors their financial estimates, completely changing how much they're willing to pay for a bottle of wine. The sheer volume of hidden variables totally undermines the idea that we are purely rational actors. Let's explore Section 3, the incentive trap. Do rewards actually work? If human behavior isn't entirely rational, what happens to the deeply held business myth that you can always improve performance by just throwing financial incentives at a problem? While Duncan Watts and his colleague ran an experiment using Amazon's Mechanical Turk, asking workers to complete simple tasks. They divided the workers into 3 groups, paying them either 1 cent, 5 cents, or 10 cents per task. Now, intuitively, you would expect the 10-cent workers to produce much higher quality work, but the accuracy across all 3 pay brackets was an absolute flatline. Paying people 10 times as much yielded 0 improvement in the quality of their work, visually striking down conventional wisdom. So why did this happen? It turns out, increased financial incentives can be completely neutralized by an increased sense of entitlement. When researchers interviewed the participants afterwards, the workers paid 1 cent felt they should have been paid 5 cents, but the workers paid 10 cents didn't feel grateful at all. They felt they were entitled to 13 cents. Everyone felt underpaid regardless of the actual rate. This just proves that trying to manipulate human behavior with the perfect incentive scheme often backfires in completely unexpected ways. Which brings us to Section 4, the Mona Lisa fluke, engineering success. We don't just use common sense to explain everyday choices. We also use it to explain grand cultural success, assuming famous things possess undeniable perfection. We assume the Mona Lisa is the most famous painting on Earth simply because it is objectively the best painting on Earth. But history tells a very different story. For centuries, the Mona Lisa was actually a relatively obscure painting. It was respected, sure, but it wasn't the global icon it is today. So what changed? In 1911, a disgruntled Louvre employee named Vincenzo Peruggia hid in a broom closet and stole the painting. The theft, the 2-year police investigation, and the dramatic recovery sparked an absolute international media frenzy. It was this cultural fluke, a literal burglary, that catapulted the Mona Lisa into a global brand name, not just its brushstrokes. And this perfectly illustrates the flawed circular logic we use for hindsight bias. We assume Harry Potter succeeded strictly because it had the exact attributes of Harry Potter. We look at it and say, the painting is successful. The painting has a mysterious smile. Therefore, it is successful because of the mysterious smile. We lazily assume entities succeed strictly because of their own attributes, completely ignoring the massive, invisible web of historical timing, luck, and emergent cultural trends that actually put them on the map. Finally, let's look at Section 5. The micro-macro problem, the pyramid of complexity. The absolute fundamental error of common sense is that we try to use the logic of individual micro-level actions to explain massively complex societal behaviors. When you multiply individual unpredictability by millions of interacting people, you get emergence. Think of it like a giant pyramid. Just as you can't understand the complex behavior of a living cell simply by looking at a single atom, you cannot understand a human organ just by looking at a cell. And scaling all the way up, you cannot accurately predict or explain massive sociological events, like a financial crash, a cultural movement, or a political revolution, using the basic common sense you use to interact with your neighbor. Society is an emergent phenomenon. It operates on a completely different scale of complexity than everyday individual life. So the crucial takeaway here is perfectly summarized in this quote. Common sense is wonderful at making sense of the world, but not necessarily at understanding it. Common sense is essentially a survival mechanism. It gives us a plausible-sounding story so we can actually get out of bed in the morning without being paralyzed by the sheer complexity of life. But if we want to truly understand policy, economics, or society, we have to abandon common sense as a predictive tool. We have to treat social problems with the same rigorous scientific method we use for medicine or engineering. I'll leave you with this final thought. The next time you look at a highly complex political issue or a struggling business or a viral cultural phenomenon and declare that the solution is just common sense, take a pause and ask yourself, what invisible forces are you failing to see? What defaults, psychological triggers, or historical flukes are hiding right beneath the surface? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and always keep questioning the obvious.